Hi folks, so unfortunately I'm not going to be able to run our lesson live today. We have a small medical situation at the house, so I'm not going to be available throughout the day to be present on Zoom for our classes. So what I'm going to do instead is spend a few minutes just recording the most important stuff that we were going to cover today and then set you up with some of the activities that we were going to be doing anyway as part of our class. Okay, so let's go over the plan for today. We'll talk about what we're doing, go over reminders and announcements, remaining extra labor opportunities, early draft thoughts, and some activities for you to complete in order to get credit for today's class. So if you're in a group project, I'd like you to set up a Zoom or FaceTime with your group so that you can kind of go through this material together. If you're working independently, I encourage you to do the same, but it's not quite as essential. Make sure that you watch the video to the end and complete the activities at the end of the presentation to get credit for today's session. Note that unlike the past few Tuesdays, I'm not going to be able to hang out in the Zoom room as much today as I ordinarily would during your asynchronous work, but I will have email open and will respond as quickly as I can. I also want to take a quick moment to apologize for any typos in this presentation. I had to put this together relatively quickly, so please bear with me. So some reminders and announcements really quickly. If you never submitted a first draft on Tuesday, please make sure that you do so, and you can find a link to the Dropbox in the Week 14 module, and you'll find your folder there. Note that if you did the extra response ELO for this project, those reflections are due Tuesday, and I'll be posting those instructions very, very quickly. Final reflections for the course are due May 13th, so make sure that you're looking over that assignment so you can think through how you might want to approach it. And note that this coming Tuesday is the final day of class, so we're going to meet as a full class on Tuesday in order to complete the course evaluations, review major course themes, and answer any final questions that you might have about these projects or the final reflection. Okay, we have 3 remaining ELOs, and that little equal sign up there is a good example of one of the little typos that you might find today. So again, my apologies. So first, there is still the extended major project 2 ELO, right? So you still have time to develop your project into an extended labor opportunity, and you might find that that might be easier than you thought, because as we're going to talk about in terms of the early drafts, there's a lot of room for development in a lot of these drafts. So maybe it won't be so hard to stretch your draft out. Final peer response assignment. So for the final reflection, you have the option of doing a peer response assignment. There's not going to be a formal first draft required for that assignment, but if you sign up and provide a first draft and respond to 3 other student drafts and complete a reflection, you will get an ELO for the assignment. So you need to sign up by Tuesday, May 4th. And you need to submit your first draft by May 6th. So that first draft is not required of the entire class, but if you're using this ELO, you need to submit it by May 6th, and it has to be a full draft. And if you do that, then I'll immediately send the drafts that you need to review back to you on May 6th, and you'll provide your feedback by Sunday, May 9th. And that will give people a couple of days to respond to that feedback and use it for their projects. So again, there's not going to be a required draft for the final reflection, but you can opt to submit a draft and provide feedback to other students in order to earn an ELO. There's also the extended final reflection, and you can see that assignment on Blackboard for details. Finally, there's going to be a collaborative reflection option. I'm putting on the next slide because I ran out of room on this one. So the collaborative reflection ELO is a group of 2 to 4 people doing an informal conversation with 2 to 3 different focus options for that conversation. I haven't posted the assignment yet, but I'll give you a quick version of this. Essentially, this is an opportunity for you to record a conversation, either an audio conversation or a video conversation using Zoom, where you'll have different ways that you might reflect on your experience of the course or these projects, compare your experiences, and try to draw a couple of conclusions about the work that you've done this semester. So essentially, it's kind of an informal conversation that you'll record with a partner or 3 people or 4 people that you can do. I will post deadlines up on Blackboard for this, along with a more elaborate description, but I want to get this on your radar. We can talk about it more on Tuesday, so that you can think about whether you would want to do this and begin identifying people with whom you'd like to do it. So you could do it with the other members of your working group, or if you know people in the class that you'd like to work with, or even if you know someone in one of my other sections and you want to do it with them, like that's fine too. Okay, now let's talk about some of the early draft thoughts. So I'm working as fast as I can to get responses back to every individual and group. It's taking a little bit of time because these are pretty, it's a lot of projects to run through, but I'm going to continue doing that as quickly as I can. There are kind of 5 areas that I want to address that I'm seeing some common issues across the drafts that I'm seeing. So introduction issues, issues with dealing with theory, a couple of minor design issues for those who are doing presentations, some thoughts on working with quotes, and most perhaps importantly, how people are engaging with their interviews. So let's run through these. Okay, introduction issues. First, you want to avoid sounding like a student. You don't need to reference the fact that this is for an assigned project. You really want to model yourself rhetorically as not a student, but as a researcher or a scholar or someone who knows what they're doing. And this is similar to what we talked about in Major Project 1. There's really no difference there, right? We're still writing for an audience of writing studies scholars. So be aware of that. Keep in mind that they don't want to think of you as a student. They want to think of you as a fellow scholar or a fellow academic. Make sure that you're telling us what we're going to be looking at, how we're looking at it, and why. And I encourage you to go back to slide 13 of the Tuesday instructions from April 20th for a reminder about what that introduction really needs to include. In theory, we should leave the introduction with a really clear sense of what question your project is investigating and what your answer to that question is. So in other words, your thesis, right? So you're asking a question about, for example, how does G's idea of doing play a role in being literate in my particular community, right? Okay, well then you're going to try and answer that question, and that's going to be your thesis. I'm going to argue that, or we're going to argue that a key component of being seen as literate in this community is the ability to do these certain kinds of things, and here's why it matters so much. In terms of dealing with theory, a number of the drafts are maybe a little bit too sloppy or loose with how they're using the theory. So first, it's really important that you establish which lens we're using. Are we using G or are we using Swales, right? And you have to be able to explain what that lens actually is, right? You need to be able to show your audience that you know at least that particular part of the theory well enough to talk about it. And finally, you need to explain why that lens makes sense for the question you're trying to ask, right? Why is G helpful for thinking about this particular community? Why is Swales useful for thinking about this particular community? And a couple of traps you're going to want to watch out for, or at least one big trap I want you to watch out for. Discourse with a capital D and discourse community are not the same thing. And you can go back to my videos in the week 13 module for more on their differences. These are 2 different concepts by 2 different theorists that try to explain 2 different elements of how language and society or groups operate. They can overlap, right? There's definitely some overlap in the theory. For example, you might argue that a discourse community, we might talk about a major on campus as being like a local discourse community using Swales, and we might also say that they participate in the broader discourse of that scientific area of study as sort of defined by G. So there can be overlap, but you can talk about both of them, but you need to be clear about how you're using them and where you're using them and why you're using them, and you want to make sure that you're using the right term for the right theorist. Also, quick note, if you're doing a podcast or a presentation, G is pronounced with the J sound. It's not G, it's G. Okay, moving on. For those of you who are doing presentations, one quick thing that I noticed, and this is kind of tricky to work with Zoom on, but frequently I'm seeing some clipping where the cameras are cutting off parts of your slides. So I would recommend narrowing your text boxes to leave space on the right side of the screen so that it reduces the risk of that occurring. You can go back and watch your presentations. You'll see it if it occurred. I also would note, either everyone in the group should have their cameras on, or no one should have their cameras on. It's distracting if you have half the group with the cameras on and half the group with the cameras off. Finally, try to avoid paragraphing on your slides except when it's essential, right? You should not have all of the text that you are saying out loud up on your presentation slides, right? The presentation slides are there to bullet point or highlight key things that you are discussing, but they're not there to provide the full text of your presentation. That's why if you're going to do that, then you should just be submitting this as a paper. Okay, working with quotes, I'm going to refer back to some other things that you can look at. So really quickly, when you reference an author for the first time, use their full name. So if you're referencing G for the first time, it's James Paul G. If you're referencing Brandt for the first time, it's Deborah Brandt. Every other time you use their name, you can just use the last name, and that's perfectly fine. Now, even more important, you have to analyze or interpret and integrate your quotes. So I've posted a video in the week 14 module called Sources, Evidence, and Citation. This is actually a video, we did this lecture live, but this is a recorded version of it from a previous semester where I go over basically the same material. So a lot of people are sort of including quotes and then not explaining why those quotes are important. I want you to check out this video and skip to 1940 to see what I'm talking about here. Or if you want just a broader review on sort of how you can integrate quotes effectively, you can start back at 14 minutes, 14 seconds. Oh, that should say too many with O's. Let's see if we can fix that fast. There we go. Too many students are using quotes from sources without demonstrating that they understand what the quote means or how the quote is relevant to what the student is discussing. So you can't just leave a quote at the end of a paragraph or reference it in your presentation unless you're going to explain why that quote matters to what you're doing. Otherwise, it comes across as though you're just including it for the sake of including it and not because it actually is relevant to what you're talking about. Okay, here's a big one that we really need to talk about, which I'm calling effective interview integration. Way too many groups are including the entire interview in their recordings or even in their written documents. You should not be including your entire interview in your projects because it's going to be the case that there's always going to be some content in that interview that is not relevant to the specific point you're trying to make. Instead, you should think about yourself as curating the interview content, right? You are highlighting the most important parts of that content. So if there is information in the interview that is not relevant, so like you don't have to have a recording of the person telling us like what their name and how old they are, right? Like you could just tell us that if that matters, even if maybe that doesn't even matter, right? So you shouldn't just be dumping all of the audio of your presentation or all the audio of your interview into the presentation and calling it a day, right? Ideally, what you should be doing is only including the parts that matter. And even if you're going to just include the whole interview, because it can be tricky to do that editing and it may not be something that you're comfortable with, you still need to contextualize what we're seeing, right? So who are we interviewing? Why are they an appropriate subject given the questions your project is investigating, right? And that should happen before we even hear the interview. And then once that interview is done, and this is critical, and this is something that's missing from really too many presentations in these first drafts, what do these responses mean and why do they matter in a way that's specific to your project, right? You have to treat your interviews as another text to be analyzed, right? You're still going to be using either Swales or G as a lens for making sense of what's going on in the interview, because odds are your interview subject is not going to be talking about their experiences with the same kind of focus on the theoretical terminology that we're focusing on. So you have to kind of translate what they're saying into terms that your audience is going to appreciate, right? So If you're focusing on swales and the way that kind of communication happens in a community, then you need to not just present the interview discussion, you need to then talk about how what came up in that interview speaks to that broader question of communication and the way that members of a community figure out how to do that effectively. All right. So here's what you're going to be doing for the remainder of your time today, and this is what I really want you focusing your attention on. So first is just a quick jumpstart writing task. What do you think is best about your current draft, and how can you spread what's best about that draft across the draft? So what are you doing well, and how can you find more ways to do that in your draft? And then what needs the most work. So I want you to just write that down so that you have it and you're thinking about that as we move into these other activities. Next, I want you to go back to the draft folders that you can access in the Week 14 module and read the peer responses that you've received. In theory, if you posted a draft and participated in the activity on Tuesday, you should have already received at least one person's feedback. If you don't see feedback in that folder, you may want to check the folder of the person who is giving you the feedback. Some people maybe posted it in the wrong spot. Either way, if you've received feedback, I want you to spend time reading that feedback and spending some time writing down your thoughts on the responses. From there, I want you to start work on revising your drafts, right? Or planning out your revisions to your drafts. As you get closer to the end of your work time, if you had submitted a draft on Tuesday and received feedback, I want you to write a one-page reflection on how you are responding, or I should say responded, how you are responding or how you've already responded to this feedback. And if you did not submit a draft on Tuesday, then A, you should submit one now, but I want you to write a one-page summary of the revision work that you did during today's class period. From there, I want you to make a detailed plan of what you need to do and how you plan to do it in order to finish this project strong. Now, if you're working as a group, you guys might compose this as a group, or if there are individual tasks that each of you must complete, you might focus on doing it that way. But each individual in the group should have their own take on this. I then want you to submit your one-page reflection or summary and your detailed plan to Blackboard in the Week 14 folder. You will find, it might not be posted there just yet, but you will find within the next hour or so, if it's not there yet, an assignment Dropbox where you can submit that so that you will receive credit for today's activities. So again, hopefully you were able to really kind of focus, pay attention to the comments I made in terms of things to think about with regards to your drafts, and you can incorporate that into your final versions. I will definitely be paying attention to the things I talked about in this presentation when I'm looking at those subsequent drafts, and I hope to see that you've taken that seriously. If you have any questions about anything that you're working on, you can send me an email and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. I can't guarantee that I'll be able to grab you on Zoom today, but if you really feel like we need to talk about something on Zoom, let me know and we'll try and set something up. We will, again, meet as a full class on Tuesday to kind of put a cap on everything. So I will see you on Tuesday.